Um, Making an assessment of an applicant's candour and honesty is one of the most important goals for an interview. Would you agree?
I would agree.
And one of the reasons that you elicit information in stages during the application process is that the panel wants to see whether there are any inconsistencies or late disclosures by the applicant. Is that right?
That's correct. As well as any change in circumstances throughout the stages of the application.
So, for example, if there is a failure to disclose something in the original application form, but it's disclosed subsequently in the personal history, you might then have an opportunity to probe during the interview about the reasons for the failure to disclose, correct?
Correct.
And ordinarily, if you ask those probing questions, you would make a note in your interview notes.
Yes, that would be correct.
Because that is important data that you are gathering about the honesty and candour of the applicant.
Correct.
In your notes, interview notes regarding question 25, which was the physical fight Townsville infringement notice question, there's no indication that any questions were asked about why Constable Rolfe didn't disclose this in his first written application. Would you agree?
Yes, that's correct.
If I suggested to you that similarly there's no indication that those questions were asked in the notes of Superintendent Sharma or Senior Constable Agnew, would you agree that it's likely that those questions were not asked?
Yes. So if I was asking questions, I would not necessarily write down every component of the response and would rely on the other panel members to record that information. But they may not record additional questions, but I would rely on them to record the responses that were provided by the candidate.
Let me put it to you this way. The answers given to question 25 suggest that Constable Rolfe gave you an account of what had happened in Townsville in 2011, correct?
That's correct.
But they say absolutely nothing about why Constable Rolfe didn't disclose that in his original written application, correct?
Correct.
Do you agree that the fact that there is no note that he was asked about his reasons for the non-disclosure and no note of any answer he gave in relation to a question of that kind, would you agree that that suggests that you didn't ask those further probing questions about honesty?
I object, Your Honour.
On what basis?
We're on 7.1 of his statement. I'm unable to remember this specific interview occasion. I do not have a memory of the candidate themselves. In fairness to this witness, it's a hypothetical question should go anyway. And what weight can you want to place on that?
I'm asking questions about practice.
It's about record keeping, how they keep their records.
That's one particular line, but to ask or to suggest that because it's not in his notes, it was never asked, in the face of his statement which says he has no specific recollection, unable to remember the specific interview and no memory of the candidate, I think it's drawing a long bow getting to answer that question wasn't asked, simply by the fact that it's absent in his notes.
Well, perhaps you could ask a little bit more about how they record information as they progress through the interview.
Yes, Your Honour, can I just give an example? I'm not sure if Mr. McMahon shaves every day of the week. Perhaps he does. If I asked him, did you shave last Tuesday? He might say, I don't remember. If he then said, I probably did because I shave every day, the evidence he gave about his practice would be relevant to Your Honour's assessment of the likelihood.
That's why I'm asking you to perhaps delve a little more deeply into the practice in relation to record keeping during the interview process.
I'm sorry, I misheard, Your Honour.
Specifically, no, counsel, we've got a general practice question, I have no issue with.
Sure. So you start with a general practice question, and then you might be able to draw an inference, or he might be able to draw an inference from what is or is not written down in this particular interview.
You gave evidence a moment ago, Mr Van Heften, that assessing the honesty and candour of an applicant is one of the most important goals at interview. Correct?
That's correct.
And so data about honesty and candour is very significant data to you as an interviewer, correct?
Correct.
If an answer was given that was relevant to an applicant's honesty, for example, an explanation for a failure to disclose something, you would consider that to be a significant answer, correct?
Correct.
Your ordinary practice would be to note down, at least in shorthand, or in short form, the substance of that answer, correct?
So I would record responses in shorthand, yes.
Given that you made no note that an explanation had been given for the failure to disclose, does that suggest to you that that question and that answer was not asked or given?
I would assume by my notes and the notes of the other panel members that I wouldn't have specifically asked any further questions at question 25 about why it wasn't reported in the initial application document.
Wasn't this something that you really needed to ask in light of the arguable failure to disclose this matter in the written application?
In terms of needed to, we would have had the information from the personal history questionnaire, which had provided details of the event prior to interview as well.
I'm not asking about what had happened. I'm asking why it wasn't disclosed in the written application. Didn't you need to ask some follow-up questions to work out the reasons for the non-disclosure?
Potentially. I might have assumed at interview, but I can't remember, that I already had that information and that it was already disclosed prior to being questioned about it via the personal history form.
Do you want to have another look at the personal history form and let me know whether anything is said in that document about the reason for the non-disclosure?
No, I'm suggesting that I might have assumed and then not probed further that he'd satisfied providing the information.
Do you agree that the information was not provided in the original written application, not the personal
Yes.
history?
Yes.
What would your assumption have been about Constable Rolfe's failure to provide the information in the written application form?
I would have assumed potentially oversight. In
Oversight.
isolation of any other information, and that he'd misinterpreted the question. They're potential assumptions, or I could also assume that he deliberately left it off.
Is it likely that you assumed that he had deliberately omitted it, given that you didn't ask any follow-up questions?
If I'd assumed that the candidate had deliberately omitted it, I would have asked probing questions.
And your note suggests that you didn't ask probing questions, correct?
Correct.
So that's unlikely to have been your assumption.
It's unlikely to be my assumption from my note that I thought he had deliberately left off the omission, given that I didn't ask further probing questions about why the information wasn't there.
Whatever your assumption was, Mr. Van Haften, we've just lost you.
Sorry, I'm still here. I can hear you.
Oh. Whatever you...
I think you can continue, Mr. Coleridge.
Whatever you assumed, it was just that. It was an assumption about Zachary Rolfe's reasons for failing to disclose the matter, correct?
Well, not knowing whether I assumed or not, but that could have been the case. Or it could have been that I hadn't connected all of the components of information together at that point in time within the interview.
I'm not necessarily being critical of you, Mr. Van Haften.
No,
I'm just
yeah.
trying to understand the process.
Yeah. And sorry, I'm just trying to explain what might have been potential assumptions at the time.
Do you think it was necessary, or do you think that you should have contacted the Queensland Police Service in order to see whether you could verify the account that you were given by Constable Rolfe?
And when you say me, do you mean the NT Police Force?
Sorry, yes, the recruitment team generally, not you personally.
Yeah. I think that's one possible avenue for verifying the information.
We looked at the account Constable Rolfe gave in the personal history, which was to the effect that he was not responsible for assaulting the unconscious man, but came to his rescue, and that when the police arrived, he spoke to them, received the ticket, and was dropped home to the barracks. You recall that?
Yes.
Can I show you another document? This is document 10, please, Beck. This is at 3-58 of the brief, Your Honour. Could we zoom in? Have you ever seen this document before, Mr. Van Haften?
I can't see it clearly, sorry.
I'll read it to you. Can we scroll down, please, Beck? I'll suggest to you that this is a Queensland police report of sorts. It's a police record that contains an account. I'm not suggesting that it's correct or incorrect, but it contains an account of what appears to be the incident Constable Rolfe told you about. It suggests that at about 3:45 in the morning, police responded to a male person who was unconscious on Flinders Street East after being assaulted. It is alleged that the male was pushed with some force, resulting in him falling backwards and hitting his head. The male was unconscious for a matter of minutes. The offender with another male has decamped in taxi number 21 from the nightclub precinct. Munding Bora 279, which I understand to be a police call sign, has intercepted this vehicle outside Laverack Barracks, confirming the two male occupants' identity, this being, and that's redacted, and Rolfe. Both are members of the ADF. I'll just pause there. That account, which is that Constable Rolfe and another individual decamped from the scene in a taxi and were intercepted by police, appears to be inconsistent with the account that you were given in the personal history. Would you agree?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. And in fact, it describes Constable Rolfe's associate as the offender. Correct?
Well, that's something that could be assumed, yes. That's what I initially assumed.
And certainly there was no suggestion in the history you were given by Constable Rolfe that he was associated with the offender, was there?
No.
Now, we don't know what the source of this information is or whether it's correct, but you'd agree that it was important that the recruitment, those who were deciding whether or not Constable Rolfe was recruited, checked to see whether accounts he gave about prior criminal offending were consistent with the records held by other police services.
Yes, I agree that the collateral information would be useful in that context.
It might have turned out, after conducting further checks, that Constable Rolfe's account was entirely accurate.
Correct?
But it might have turned out that it was a fabrication.
Yes.
Until those probity checks were conducted, it would be impossible to say, correct?
Correct.
Okay. Do you know why those checks weren't done in Constable Rolfe's case?
No.
You also knew that Constable Rolfe had applied to the Queensland Police Service, didn't you?
Yes, and to other police services as reported by him.
And indeed, you understood that application to be pending.
I would assume that that's what we would have thought and what I would have thought.
Do you think it was important that the Northern Territory Police Force seek the applications to those other police forces in order to determine whether inconsistent information had been provided by the applicant?
I think that would make sense, the comparison across jurisdictions, but I don't know if that was common practice or if in fact feasible.
Certainly, had you made that inquiry with the Queensland Police Service after the 7th of March, you would have discovered that the application was not pending but had been rejected for integrity reasons. Is that correct?
I think if the NT Police Force had been able to confirm the progress with that application, further information would have been available, yes.
That information, namely that he had been rejected and directed not to apply for 10 years for an integrity breach, would have been significant to the recruitment panel's decision, would it not?
Yes, that's correct.
Are you aware of why? You said that it wasn't common practice to seek that information, but are you aware of any reason why it wouldn't be feasible?
No, I said I'm not sure if it was common practice, and I'm not sure if organisations would be free to release that level of information to other organisations.
I want to finally ask you some questions about whether you think that there are any limitations or deficiencies in what was the interview process in 2016.
Yeah, I think it's common limitation to both assessment via psychometric battery and via in-person interviews is that it's largely reliant upon self-report, which highlights the importance of being able to gather collateral information.
Some of that collateral information includes records held by other government departments. Can you think of any other examples of collateral information that we haven't talked about?
If a person's health is relevant to their occupational application, well then medical records could be relevant as well.
What about psychological evaluation? I take it that the mere fact that you participated in the interview doesn't mean that you conducted a psychological evaluation of Constable Rolfe.
So the mere fact that I, as a panel member, participated in the interview?
Yes, the mere fact that you happen to be a psychologist doesn't mean that this was a psychological evaluation, does it?
No, it's an occupational evaluation for a specific position.
Do you think, given the nature of a police officer's role, some form of psychological evaluation could be useful?
Yeah, and I would assume that was the function of the psychological battery and the interpretive report to inform the process of psychologically relevant principles for the occupation.
Do you think that the psychometric battery is sufficient for that purpose?
For determining risk inherent to the position, and in the context of multiple applicants and the processes of the agency at the time, I think, yeah.
When you say the context of multiple applicants, what you're saying is for resourcing issues.
Yes, correct.
Okay. So there are other more intensive or involved forms of psychological evaluation that might be more expensive or not feasible to roll out on a larger scale. Is that what you're saying?
Well, I imagine there would be.
Do you have any awareness of updates that the Northern Territory Police Force have made to the psychological testing of police applicants in the last 12 to 18 months?
Only what I've been told by council in the last few days, that the AIFP Safe Select process is no longer used, and that another product is used in recruitment and selection.
Your Honour, no further questions.
Just so Your Honour, it's alerted to the situation. A group called Tallagy is now has the responsibility for undertaking psychological assessments, and the information about that is to be found in Deputy Commissioner Smallpatch's F2.
Thank you. Any other questions? Yes, Mr. Bolton.
Is it all right if I sit and lean into the microphone?
Perfectly acceptable, and hopefully everyone will be able to hear you.
I'm going to ask you questions, Mr. Van Haften, and my name is Philip Bolton. I'm a barrister representing the North Australian Aboriginal Justice Agency. During the course of the interview process, including the psychological testing that was undertaken by the private provider, were there any questions that were designed to explore the applicants' familiarity with Aboriginal people or their attitudes towards Aboriginal people?
There are no specific questions within the interview protocol, but there are questions within the psychometric battery, but not evident in the report for Mr. Rolfe in relation to racist or discriminatory attitudes, which suggests that he hasn't endorsed any of those items and risk hasn't been detected for those issues within the psychometric battery.
Apart from the psychometric battery, was it the practice to ask applicants coming to the Northern Territory about their familiarity with Aboriginal people generally?
There is a practice at the interview for generally asking people what it would be like to work as a police officer within the Northern Territory, and potentially to be working as a police officer within remote communities. And many of the scenarios within the interview are situated as examples of working in remote communities, remote Aboriginal communities.
The scenarios that are included in the interview plan included some scenarios about remote communities, but it seems that Mr. Rolfe was not asked to comment on any of those particular scenarios. Is that correct?
Yes.
Do you think that every applicant should be asked some scenarios about their potential dealings with Aboriginal people?
I think that would be helpful, given the context of policing within the Northern Territory.
Mr. Coleridge pointed out to you 3 areas in the battery of testing that called for some degree of advertence during the course of the interview process. Could you explain what, if anything, was asked of the applicant, Mr. Rolfe, that touched upon, firstly, an increased interest or suggestion that he might be more than the average person aggressive?
Yes. So there's a series of questions throughout the interview where we would anticipate gathering further information around risk issues. So questions 6 to 8, where we would explore people's motivations for wanting to be a law enforcement officer, trying to determine if any of those responses suggested a propensity for overcompensation in terms of authority. Questions 22 to 37, the personal problem areas, don't necessarily directly ask about what are you aggressive or not, but their context of behavioural interviewing often allows further exploration of those risk issues. The scenarios and the questions about firearms use also try to assess how people would respond when they're questioned in terms of their processes and how they would take responsibility. And even though they're framed about a firearms use scenario, are essentially about how someone would respond to being disciplined in public and disciplined in front of peers. And then more importantly, those risk issues are clarified at the critical items section, point 45, where one of the panel members, typically the psychologist, would pose that these questions are important for the panel to understand why the candidate provided a specific response and invite further explanation about why the response was provided by the candidate for particular items.
So in the context of aggression, the disclosure at answer 25 to the fight in Townsville would have added to the caution that the committee was taking in relation to aggression factors, presumably. Agreed?
The scenario as presented by Mr. Rolfe would have highlighted his willingness to use aggression to protect another person.
So do I take from that answer that actually his description of the Townsville incident helped to assuage any concerns the committee had about him being overly aggressive?
Yes, but based on his description of events.
Yeah. What was the relevance of the factor that related to his childhood attitudes towards his parents?
What is the relevance in relation to the psychometric battery?
Or Firstly, that, and then secondly, in relation to your interview process.
Yes. So I suppose one component of that was just in relation to his attitude towards authority. And I would assume in terms of the psychometric battery, it's highlighting a predisposing circumstance that links to why his attitudes might be in a particular way.
And does that also feed into the other concern that emerged from the battery about Mr. Rolfe not taking criticism very well?
Yes, potentially.
What responses in the interview assisted the interviewers to deal with those interrelated concerns sourced in the battery?
The same set of questions that I described before.
What answers in particular helped to calm you down on the issue, or helped to convince you that he was a suitable applicant?
I'd have to reflect back through.
If you don't
The
mind, just
interview
take a
guide.
minute. Take a minute.
Yep. So what I would suggest is that if we had concerns about any of those issues via his responses, we would have noted those down at the least, and that would have been confirming information for the test battery. We're also very aware in the interview that people are unlikely to tell us information that would reflect negatively on their application.
Got it, yeah. So, are there any particular notes in your copy of the interview plan that helps to deal with the concerns thrown up by the battery about his ability to obey directions and his ability to critically analyse himself?
I think the only response from him about following directions that threw light, but which there seemed to be a reasonable explanation, was his description of an event during military training where there was a live fire exercise, and he disagreed with his superior, but thought that he and others were being put at risk and in danger.
And that was an explanation which was perfectly reasonable, it said,
Yes,
and sensible.
yes.
So not much self-criticism in that answer. The opposite. I knew better than my supervisor, right?
Well, I think in the context of what was occurring in defence is that there is sufficient evidence to say that sometimes people are put at risk.
Yeah.
What was highlighted in the notes is that he's raised it as an incident where he's questioned authority, and he's provided an example of why he questioned it, and it was safety related, and the panel would have had no further way to assess that information.
There's no way to assess it without reference to some documents from the ADF.
Correct?
Does the Northern Territory Police Force always, sometimes, generally or never seek ADF records for former ADF personnel applicants?
Your Honour, I wonder if a friend could be particular as to the timing of his question, because as you would be aware, there's been a shift in process between the relevant time and now.
I think Mr Van Heften was in that role for 5 years, so perhaps over that 5-year period.
Yes, thanks.
So my awareness would be, whilst not being a member of the police recruitment team, that we would attempt to request the medical and relevant disciplinary information from defence.
How often was it received in your experience?
I've got no awareness of that.
Right, fine. You would get some sort of feedback though from others involved in the process before you would sign off as a panel member, wouldn't you?
Correct.
So from...
Well, I was just going to say, sorry, so potentially afterwards, but any offer or any recommendation from the panel would be contingent upon further information as it was received. For instance, probity checks around criminal history, health information as those health checks occurred, or any other information that was deemed relevant.
So it would have been open to the committee, for instance, to recommend that Mr Rolfe be given the job, subject to being cleared following a check with the Queensland Police about his Queensland Police criminal record.
Potentially, and the probity checks were still pending.
What do you know what is involved in probity checks?
Not specifically, but generally a background check with any intel held by NT Police, and then a criminal history check through the national system.
So a criminal history check in the Northern Territory through the national system would have thrown up the bare fact of him having received a infringement notice of some description in Queensland for a public disorder incident.
Do I know if that would be the case?
That's what I'm suggesting would be the case. Can you confirm that?
I can't confirm that. I don't know what level of charge would be listed or offence.
Fine. So you never got this sort of feedback?
I was aware of whether the history check and the probity check would have occurred, potentially after the appointment or offer, but it would not be one of my accountabilities as a panel member to seek that information or to manage the flow of information once received.
Yeah. In all the time that you participated in these interviews, probably hundreds if not thousands of them, is that right?
Well, hundreds of times, yes.
Hundreds. Did anyone ever answer questions or lead you to conclude that they were harbouring racist attitudes?
Yes,
How often did that get revealed?
I can't tell you the frequency, but I know it would have happened
Are we
and
talking-
been revealed in the psychometric battery, but also revealed through self-report at interview.
Just to give us an idea of whether it was extremely common or extremely uncommon or something, could you give a qualitative assessment generally about how often this happened?
It wasn't highly common,
Not
and my hunch
highly
is
common.
not highly common,
Can you
but it
give
did occur. I'm
Was
sorry,
that
I can't be, yeah.
That's all right.
Yeah. But it was something that we were aware of.
Was it a disqualifying factor
Yes,
per se?
for me as a panel member.
Yep. And for the panel itself? If it,
And generally there was consensus on issues such as that between panel members. So I'd assume yes, for other panel members as well.
how often was it identified by you and your colleagues in an interview that an applicant had been actively dishonest in their approach during the course of their application?
Sorry, I can't tell you frequency or percentages, but it did occur.
So we're talking about it was not highly frequent, not highly common.
It was not frequent, no, that
Okay.
people would be dishonest. Yeah.
Was active dishonesty a singular disqualifying factor for you and the panel?
If we were aware of dishonesty, yes, it would be for me.
And the panel, generally?
I would assume so, yes.
Well, what about someone who is revealed to be, someone who reveals not just the participation in violent incidents in the past, but who enjoys the prospect of being involved in violent confrontations? Did you ever find anyone who fitted into that category?
Yes,
Was that a disqualifying factor?
yes,
Universally, when it was identified?
and by universally, are you meaning in my decision making or?
In your decision making, and to your knowledge, the colleagues who sat with you on the interview panels?
I think I can clarify for myself that if Mr. Rolfe had suggested that he had multiple events where he had demonstrated aggression to save others in similar circumstances, that would highlight a range of risks. But based on the information that we had at the interview, whilst of note, wouldn't have necessarily been an exclusion factor.
Is a conviction for assault a necessary exclusion factor?
Yes,
A conviction?
of assault, yes.
Yes, okay. What about assisting someone during the course of an assault?
I would say yes.
Well, did you know what the legal characterisation was of the Townsville incident when you interviewed him?
No.
Well, if participation in an assault would have disqualified him from joining the police, why didn't you ask or put in train some query about what this incident was that led to a ticket in Queensland?
Because I would have assumed that if there was further information to the incident, it would have been raised and identified in the probity check and the criminal history check. And I'd also assume that if I asked further information, that would obviously present negative responses from the candidate to exclude them, that they're very unlikely to provide those kinds of details at interview.
All right. Could you explain what responses led you to the conclusion that Mr. Rolfe had sound ethical skills?
So his responses to the scenarios and problem solving
And
would generally be an example of that.
what about him being a prime candidate? What did you think made him a prime candidate?
In terms of his problem solving skills, in terms of the overall battery being generally highlighting strengths, in terms of his feedback about his own attitudes towards self-care, based on the information that we had at the time.
Thank you. You're both obviously demanded in that.
Ms Moreau?
Thank you, Your Honour. Mr Van Heften, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
My name is Paula Moreau and I act for the Brown family of Kumanjayi Walker. I only have a few questions for you. Could I ask, it seems that only you, as the psychologist on the panel, receive the psychometric testing report and review its contents. Is that the case, generally?
No, that's incorrect. The whole panel has access to the report.
I see. Would it surprise you to know that others have a different recollection?
Yeah, that would be very surprising.
So from your memory, and I realise you don't remember this particular interview, but that it was your standard practice that each of the members of the panel would have this report well in advance of the interview process.
All members of the panel would have access to the recruitment file, in which there'd be the application information, including the report. We wouldn't necessarily get that any further in advance of time than a few minutes before the interview.
I see.
The time between interviews, and that would definitely be the case for anyone outside of the police recruitment team, because we weren't in that work area and didn't have access to the files. There might be an occasion, there might be an occasion where we would, as a team, review all of the reports of further shortlisting, and we would use the information in the reports and the application information at a shortlisting as a panel.
So if I understand you correctly then, could you tell us, as a matter of course, how much time would you usually have with a report such as this?
If on a general day of recruitment interview,
Yes.
we would do on average about 5 interviews per day, generally spend at a minimum around about an hour with each candidate, sometimes more, and we might have a break of 15 to 20 minutes in between that to consider the outcome, write the recommendation. If we weren't recommending someone, that'd take a longer process because we would justify why the recommendation to proceed wasn't occurring. And then within that time, we'd also have to review the next candidate's file.
So within 15 minutes, you would be forming your conclusions from the previous interview and reviewing the application, the person's all the collateral information that had been collected by that point, including the results of some psychometric testing for each applicant.
Yes, I think on average between 15 and 30 minutes would be roughly how that would occur.
I see. Did you think that was a sufficient time for you to be able to get across all of the information in relation to each applicant you were interviewing?
Well, I think that was the time that we had available. So we had to utilise it as effectively as we could. I think the information that we had available was the information on the recruitment file,
Yes.
and then subsequently from interview, which was largely the written application info, resume, certificate, a checklist by the candidate about any medical conditions, and the recruitment psychological report was available. And then within the minutes prior to interview, the personal history form which they completed as they arrived at the interview location.
Yes, all right. I realise that you're operating under some constraints, but do we take it that you would have preferred longer time with these materials to improve your capacity to prepare the interview?
Well, I think additional time would help, but the interview was structured.
Yes, you've got a set of standardised questions, except for question 45, which relates to the critical items that might be raised from the psychometric testing, correct?
Correct. Yeah.
And they are the additional questions you would prepare for the purposes of the interview.
Correct. So I'll just say, so in terms of additional questions, it was a standardised process. So candidates were informed that they've endorsed some items within the testing that not many people endorse. So the panel likes to get additional information about why they said true, why they said false, or yes or no. It doesn't mean that they were correct or not, and the statements were read out. So that was standardised as well.
I see. However, there was some discretion, was there not, once you are asking the particular standardised questions to formulate follow-up questions from the information that you're provided by the candidate?
Yes, within scope of the question.
Yes. The standardised approach to questioning, is that something that you understand from your experience over that time was a useful and reliable process for you to use?
Yes.
Okay.
And I also think necessary for the organisation to stick to a largely standardised process when dealing on occasions with complaints of discrimination, when candidates perceived they were asked questions that they didn't anticipate being asked. So going off the general script in terms of the interview protocol had other risks for the organisation as well.
Thank you. Were there any questions in the interview framework that were designed to identify some of the issues you discussed earlier in your evidence for persons who might have had a military background in relation to, say, exposure to trauma or, the factors of sensitisation and desensitisation that you discussed earlier? What are the kinds of questions, if any, in the interview process that might elicit relevant information around those areas?
No specific ones for a military cohort.
I see. Given your experience working with frontline workers in both the police force and, as I understand, also veterans, would you would you think it prudent to include questions designed to elicit those pieces of information?
I think questions just around general mental health, and then I think if they could be tailored to also relate to what could be trauma or distressing situations, that could be useful.
Thank you. Now, you've made some observations about post-recruitment assessment, and I just wanted to ask you a couple of things about that. Firstly, you mentioned in your evidence that there's a 3-month, 6-month, and I think 12-month check-in, is that right, with new recruits, in your experience at the NT Police Force?
Well, I was suggesting that there could be reviews, yes.
I see.
But
that there should be, not that there was. Is that what your evidence was?
Yes, I was suggesting that they could be useful intervals.
Yes. And that was not in place at the time that you worked for NT Police Force.
I'm sorry, I'm not understanding the question now in terms of...
That's okay. I think you've already answered it. And when you're talking about that as a recommendation, is that would that involve a welfare inquiry or include particular questions designed to identify perhaps some less obvious impacts of the exposure to frontline work over that period?
Okay, so if we're talking about my information through this morning about the welfare checks or the well checks, I think...
The check-ins, yes.
Yeah, okay, sorry, I was getting confused about other recommendations that I suggested. So I think the interval is really around having a structured opportunity for people to be able to access support. But I think it's both about recognising from an organisational point of view that there are inherent risks and inherent demand. There's an opportunity for people to access support without stigma associated with it if it's a structured opportunity. and there's an opportunity to get some initial early intervention feedback from a mental health practitioner if there's issues of concern being identified.
Okay, so it looks like your suggestion is perhaps two-pronged, both for welfare purposes for the individual, as well as, secondly, organisationally, to ensure that that person is travelling along without any psychological difficulties.
Yes, I think it's one example of a strategy that can do that.
Yes, and the other strategy that you've spoken of is persons being under observation during their early periods of training and perhaps probationary work, correct?
Correct. Yes.
And are you suggesting they're under observation by someone with your expertise, that is a psychologist who might be alert to psychological indicators?
No, I wasn't suggesting that they be reviewed or under observation by a mental health practitioner.
I see.
I was suggesting that there's the opportunity to assess the same characteristics relating to risk that were reviewed at recruitment throughout the course of training and supervision, especially at early career stages.
All right. My final question is, past this initial period that we've been speaking about, are there any circumstances where you think there should be check-ins post-incident, for instance, or other factors that might occur during someone's career in the police force where, instead of relying upon voluntary self-reporting, there might be a process that should be put into place?
Yes, so I can describe the processes that were in place at the
Okay,
time.
thank you. What were they?
So they were, as a significant event or a critical incident occurred, that was reported. So the incident was reported to the employee support team, including a description of the event and the members that were exposed to that situation. And then the employee support team would have carriage of offering some level of support, depending on the event, to the personnel involved. Sometimes that would be an acknowledgement that they'd attended a stressful situation and a reminder about services that were available. And sometimes that would be a more direct engagement with those personnel through a meeting to review any heightened reactions, either soon after or further down. And that would be a complementary response alongside ideas like the wellness check or the periodic reviews. Yeah.
I see. Was there in place in your time in the position with NT Police Force where there might have been some disciplinary or disciplinary approaches or responses to a member's conduct where you as a psychologist or in your centre of your services would be incorporated as part of that process?
So if through a disciplinary process it was recognised that someone would benefit from support, that might be a recommendation from that process, and someone would have the opportunity to engage the services of the employee support team, but only in a voluntary context.
I see.
People weren't mandated or directed.
And your employee services, were you based in Darwin?
So the employee support services main office was based in Darwin.
And there was also an office in Alice Springs, was there?
An office in Alice Springs, correctly, and then visiting services throughout the NT.
Okay. And in your experience, was your office, your services, used regularly in relation to disciplinary processes or not?
Not in relation to disciplinary processes. There was a separation. And I think part of the separation was instrumental to not creating another barrier to people accessing services relevant to treatment and support.
All right. Thank you. They're all my questions. Sorry, finish your answer.
I was just going to say, and that the connection with the disciplinary process or a fitness for duties assessment process, that increases the likelihood that some people would perceive a barrier to accessing the services that were available. So a separation was maintained.
Yes, thank you.
Any other? Yes, Ms Oselmans. I note the time, but we need to see if we can get finished. I'm not sure who else has questions.
Certainly, I don't, excuse me, Your Honour, I don't anticipate being very long.
Well, we'll take your questions and then we'll work out where we go from there.
Thank you, Your Honour.
Sorry.
Jump in front of you. That's okay, I'll go after you. So, my name is Sally Oslands. I'm appearing in these proceedings for the Northern Territory Police Association.
Yes.
I just wanted to, if I could go back to the matters that you were talking about at the beginning of your evidence in relation to the provision of services to members particularly. And you said that you'd obviously been employed by police from January 2009 to December 2018. I think that's in your statement. And I recall your evidence being that there were about 10 people employed in that unit at the time. Is that right?
Yes, correct.
Was it always 10 people or did the numbers fluctuate?
The numbers would fluctuate as you would expect with it, just in terms of recruitment and attrition. But roughly there was between 3 or 4 psychologists, generally 3 peer supporters, 2 chaplains, and that might fluctuate around that.
When you say,
as well as the manager's position, sorry.
And the manager. When you say peer supporter, what was the role of the peer supporters?
To provide, so they were police members who were performing a role as a peer supporter in the agency.
Okay. Were those, did those people have particular qualifications or training in the provision of mental health services?
So the primary qualification for a peer supporter was shared lived experience with the cohort of clients. Yep.
Sure.
And the training included on-the-job training, and at that point in time, the general mental health sector had very limited options for specific training for peer supporters. That's not the case now within Australia or the NT. But part of the on-the-job training would have included participation in workshops such as mental health first aid, applied suicide intervention, and other in-house training as provided by the team about engaging with people and providing services or contributing to services like critical incidents, follow-ups and reviews and support to staff.
Okay. Sorry, just at the beginning of when you were answering that question, you said it's not the case now. You say that there are more training opportunities for those positions now?
I'm saying in general within the mental health sector there are.
Right.
I don't know about what's access now.
Okay. So over the period that you were employed with Northern Territory Police, are you able to comment on whether you saw an increase or a decrease in the demand for services over that period?
I think there was an increase in the use of services. I think the service provision though was at multiple levels, which included things like the well checks, like the periodic reviews. It included participation in mental health literacy training. It included participation in other workshops, and it included self-referral, so either crisis support or treatment services, both through the in-house team and as well as to the services brokered within community. And I'd assume that the HR department would be able to provide information about whether it was stable or increasing or decreasing.
Sure. When you talk about crisis support, is that a particular kind of support provided, or is the reference to crisis linked to a particular incident requiring intervention by a service?
So not specific to critical incident support, but that there's a family member or an employee in distress and they contact the team for some temporary support,
Right.
to either problem solve that or to talk through that situation.
Okay. And are you able to, in relation to critical incidents, what sorts of things are categorised as critical incidents?
So potentially traumatising events, which could be direct exposure to danger or horrific situations as categories of events.
Sure. And in your assessment, how important is it for members to have some sort of welfare intervention following a critical incident?
I think it's important for personnel to understand the personal impacts of those events and to have an opportunity to engage in support if needed.
And do you think there's likely to be adverse outcomes if people don't receive that intervention after a critical incident?
I think I'm making a distinction about people being given an intervention and people understanding the impact of an event and having services that they can access. And I think people are more likely to access services if there's some level of acknowledgement of the event as being potentially stressful, and having frequent reminders of the services that they can access. And I think in that context, as events get recognised, a timely contact to people, either via a professional support team or via their colleagues or via their supervisors, is helpful.
So would you agree, given your comments earlier about the ongoing reluctance of people to seek support for their mental well-being, that positive intervention by a service provider or a supervisor or someone of that nature, that's going to be more likely to encourage people to engage with services?
I think there are some people that wouldn't engage in those services, and those types of follow-up would not have much of an impact all the time. And people's response to those contacts are likely to be associated with their pre-existing positive attitudes about accessing support.
Sorry, that last bit, without support, if they've got a
So
pre-existing positive attitude.
to accessing support, then they're most likely to make use of those contacts.
Right.
But there'll be a cohort of people that, either impacted by stigma or disagree about the usefulness of it or don't perceive the impact of the event as being significant enough. And they may not necessarily respond to the overtures via colleagues or peers or via a support team.
Sure. Just moving away from critical...
Can I just interrupt? Sorry, Miss Oslands. You said that, attitudes might be formed where there is a pre-existing positive experience in receiving support. Is that what you're trying to generate? For example, if there are wellness checks that are part of the training and probationary period, establishing that experience of positive support?
Yes, that would be one example with either early career personnel or existing personnel. And my experience of that is that having a relationship with a support team over time improves the likelihood that people will engage positively in crisis when offers of support are made.
So the wellness checks are kind of two-way one, it might identify issues early, but two, it can also establish a good experience in receiving support and building rapport so that you're more likely to engage in support later on.
Yes, and similar to peer support services, pastoral care, all of the mental health literacy training, they're all opportunities in a similar way that help reinforce positive attitudes and relationships with service providers.
And the approach taken largely appears to be an offer and opt-in approach. What do you think of the possibility of changing that, particularly if there are critical incidents, to an approach where it is expected that people will engage unless they positively opt out, so that the expectation by the organisation is one of engagement, but you allow people to opt out if they choose to do so?
Yeah, I think that's how I understood the processes as they occurred when I was in the organisation. So, yeah, there's an expectation that supervisors would notify the team, and then from that notification, services would be offered, and people could engage or say they were okay and opt out.
So just on wellness checks, did I understand your evidence earlier that there are ongoing wellness checks for members who work in high-risk areas?
I don't know what services are being provided within NT Police Force at the moment.
During your period there, were there identified work units that were considered more high risk than others that received additional attention in terms of wellness checks on an ongoing basis?
Yes, so there were identified work units, and the history of the well checks within NT Police was that they were instigated as ideas by particular work units. For instance, the teams that were dealing with child abuse material or domestic violence units, and those work units continued over time to engage in well checks. And throughout the time I was with the organisation, other work units, including some general duties teams in remote stations, were engaged in well check processes as well. However, there was no resource capability to deliver well checks to everybody within the organisation, and I think there would be an argument to say that just mandated well checks with every member of the police force might not be the best use of resources as well. All personnel had the option to request that type of service, whether their work unit was participating in it as a unit level strategy, and those individual requests would be accommodated.
So you just mentioned there that you have been, or you were aware that there was a wellness initiative in a remote station. Are services generally available in regional and remote areas?
I don't know what services are provided through the employee support team at present.
During the period that you were there, were services readily available to officers in regional and remote areas?
Well, there would have been limitations. Services would have been available via telephone, and to some stations, depending on the engagement with the regional command, there might have been a review and visiting schedule as well.
I presume that you will agree with me that proper resourcing of mental health services supporting frontline workers is crucial.
Yes, I agree.
And that the provision of services is important not only for the member in order to be able to perform their functions and duties, but you would agree that where there are stresses or anxiety or depression or things of that nature arising from work, those issues translate into often personal and family relationships and have adverse effects in that regard.
Yes, there's potential for that.
And things that might contribute to, generally speaking, poor mental health would be things like fatigue, in addition to trauma and the things that we've already talked about.
Yes, I'd agree.
And would you agree that members who feel unsupported by an organisation or the organisation that employs them, that would also be a contributing factor to poor mental health conditions?
Yes, I think an individual's perception of support would be a factor related to their health and their attitudes around accessing support.
Yeah, so if members are in remote areas seeking relief or respite which is not provided, that can be a contributing factor to poor mental health outcomes.
Yes, that's foreseeable.
They're my questions. Thank you, Your Honour. Thank you. Sorry, Julie, I jumped in
Who else has questions, just so I can get an idea?
I do probably only about 5 minutes.
And who else?
5 or so from the press as well.
All right, I think we better take the lunch break, but can we come back at 2:05? Mr Van Heften, we'll take a short lunch break. We'll come back at 2:05 and hopefully we'll get the links up and be ready to complete your evidence quite quickly.
Thank you, Your Honour.
Sorry, I didn't mean to jump in front of you. She was saying in your question, she's coming. Oh, maybe there isn't anyone. Oh. I was disappointed.
Oh, that's all right.
I'm just going to ask the 2 things. 2 questions. Well, to try and break it out like disinformation. So what is it?
Right. Okay. Thank you. It's very
Did you see my email back to you? Oh, no, I didn't. I said it's too hard. It's just a course in the answer. No worries. That makes sense.
Oh, are you about to what I'm about to? This is similar to what I'm about to email. Make it appropriate to increase the time and
In terms of the medical records.
yeah.
Yeah. I will just send an email to. So I've suggested. But I'm suggesting just looking at the timetable, which does not come from me, it comes from the timetable. And starts more slowly and quickly in the day. Maybe the lawyers can just swoop through on some of the Tuesday morning stuff.
Yeah.
You know, it's really not trying to get eyes on these places.
Yeah.
So let's say an hour, let's say whatever the committee is thinking, an hour or 80 minutes before that.
Yeah.
The lawyers get told you can go to these places and you can join the view if you want to.
Yeah.
Or
Yeah.
something. But I have to give instructions, but that, to me, that seems like a practical way.
I think that's very.
It's very quiet out there early in the morning.
Do you think that specific
Still make it
in a
one or two things. Yeah.
But do you think that community
No. Oh, yeah. So you go. Oh, no. But that's one question. And the other one is to add.
They will do that. But there's a lot of thought gone into some of the viewing, like House 501, 567, that kind of stuff.
Yes.
But the suggestions just come around about the medical clinics and nurses' quarters. I think
I don't think the committee would be very interested in that, but I feel you can check. But I think it'll just be, I don't think we should invite the committee to be very interested in that. We should just say the coroner has to see these things as a matter of law. And we'll just move it forward.
And as part of it, I think it's also in the email I just sent, just kind of a good general orientation to get a sense of things. That's part of it. I think that's exactly what we're looking for. It's really well with that.
Yeah, so you think maybe not do that one then?
Yeah.
But tension, whatever tension there is in terms of the environment, the whole thing working, we've got by Monday night.
Yeah.
Tuesday is going to be, and it's on the agenda, and then, so I think Tuesday morning is the best.
Are you able to?
Yeah,
that's
that's
about that? Yeah,
But
that's
I
funny,
haven't
that
heard back from the
sounds
committee, which we can do over lunchtime to find out.
That sounds great.
I think we really just tell them that that's what should happen. Because it doesn't involve doing sensitivities, it's just talking about with the coroner. In terms of talking to us and answer this question, in terms of me standing up and speaking with a proposal, which when I read that, my little heart stopped. I'm so excited to speak. I'm assuming you really want me just to explain to the listening public what's going on, because Tom wants to be, so I don't think.
Well, no, I think that's right, and it's also to give the opportunity
No, well, what I need to know is.
that can be laid out.
Well, I'll just stand up and say,
Yeah. Well, let's sit down together.
we went to the community saying, we
Thanks.
invited the coroner to come, what's your proposal? They come back, it's not driven by the lawyers or by your office, it's just the community saying, this is what we think. We've all got the timetable, everyone seems happy with it, but from what I've heard so far.
Yeah.
And,
Can I add one further suggestion?
Yes.
Sorry, I don't want to cut you off, but I think it might be helpful. I think it would be helpful for people to get a sense of the efforts that have gone into consulting, because I know you guys, and I don't mean you have to like a category or your meetings, but to get a bit of a sense so that then we can make it
it's still
clear,
live,
perhaps.
very strong.